Okay. So are there any groups that want to volunteer to give their conclusions? Nope. Oh, wait. You guys are 5? 4? Okay.
I would say in this case, you might be not consistent because the end doctor will always get the same pain. And
Mm-hmm.
in this case, you may have a higher probability to get sick or to get your death. So given this
Okay, so you're saying basically that the nurse was exposed to higher risk and but gets actually probably lower pay than the doctor. So so it'd be inconsistent. So yeah, so certainly okay. So I see. You guys are basically approaching it from sort of the standpoint of if you use this to try to estimate, like if you use the observations on their pay to try to estimate the VSL, would you get a good estimate? And I agree that the answer to that would be no. It would also trying to do it in that case is also difficult because they have different levels of training and so forth, right? And so you're going to think the doctor gets paid more because they had to go through more medical school and everything. And so as we discussed, like one of the problems when trying to do these comparisons between different jobs that might have different risk levels is that essentially like there are other characteristics about the jobs that might also differ. So the differences in pay aren't just due to differences in risk. The other complication in this scenario is probably like probably when you took the job, you weren't thinking that there would be some highly, well, I guess not highly contagious, but some contagious disease that has a 50% chance of killing you that you would be exposed to, because in general that wouldn't be the case for hospitals. But yeah, so I agree with that. So what I was thinking though was more in the question of like, does the action of taking or of like being willing to go in and expose yourself to that risk, is that consistent with some of the VSL values that we've been talking about? So I don't know. So group 1, do you guys?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the difference in the formulas that people really effective. So I think she had a slightly better chance of what you think about the than an average nurse. And I thought that since it looked like she didn't necessarily take all the necessary precautions, but did not prevent himself properly, her perceived risk of contracting Ebola was a lot lower than perhaps it should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought that if maybe the connection about like 1%, then getting anything kind of about 50,000 would sort of get her to
the VSL. Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Are there any other? Does anybody think that are there opinions to the contrary that her actions were like sort of implied a VSL substantially below the VSL levels that we've been talking about in the course? No. Do you guys want to?
We kind of thought she would have low VSL because she was predicting activity.
Sure.
She was like, why don't you jump into you might not have
Sure. So basically, you're saying that you think the risks were substantially higher than. Well, I mean, I guess the question is, do you think that the risks were higher than she perceived, or do you think she knew the risks were high and was just like, I'm just going to do it anyway?
I honestly think it was the latter version because knowing the risk and knowing, don't worry about it, it seems fairly foolish.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it depends what exactly like what risk level you're thinking about as well. But sorry, Robin. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Sure. So they could be. When you say affect their own valuation of it, I mean, I guess there's two ways to look at it. So one would be that if you're somebody who were really averse to these risks to begin with, then you wouldn't have gone into this profession, I guess, which would be more about like the types of people who are going into the profession. And then the other is that you have there are things that are entering your utility function other than the risk and the monetary repercussions, which would basically be the sort of like moral imperative that you either had before or sort of took on as part of the entering part of the profession. Sorry, which are you? You're in 5, and then you guys 8 or yeah, you think so? Well, so I guess my question is sort of by taking the risk, we could, well, if we knew what her preferences, if we knew what she thought the odds of getting infected were, and if we knew sort of what the monetary repercussions of not treating the patient would be, then we would be able to calculate the VSL. Obviously, we don't know those two things, but the question was basically sort of like for basically like do you think that for reasonable estimates of those two things that the implied VSL would be like way below or way above the top well really I guess whether or not the implied VSL would be way below the values that we've been talking about in the class, which it seems like sort of I guess most people are thinking it could be consistent with the values that we've been talking about, although group 7 is not agree, or maybe there's dissension within. So right. Okay, so let me give my opinion on it, or my reaction to it, which is that was kind of my first reaction. But when you think about it for a little while, I'm not so sure. So I think my gut reaction was a little similar to you guys, and like, wow, that's sort of taking on too much risk there, or I would be surprised that somebody is taking on that kind of risk if we believe that the VSL were say several $1 million, something like that. But if you actually think about it and go through the numbers, I'm not so sure. So that if I think about it, I kind of come around to like no, what we're seeing is probably kind of consistent with some of the numbers we've been talking about. So the two questions are, as I said, like what are the perceived risks, and then what are the what are the potential monetary repercussions. So the perceived risks, I'm kind of in line with Robin and maybe the rest of our group, which are that like my guess would be like something on the order of like maybe like 1 or really like 0.1 to 1%, right? So basically like somewhere between maybe 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. So the reason why I would think that is because they did treat a couple other patients who like were Americans who got sick in Africa and then got evacuated back to the U.S. So they did treat those people in other hospitals. You figure for each treatment case there have to be like probably dozens of personnel who are going to come in direct or at least indirect contact with the patients. So if you sort of see multiple treatment cases occurring and nobody gets sick, then you figure the odds have to be less than like 1 in 100, right? Because there's probably over like multiple treatment cases, and there's probably been like at least 100 people nobody's gotten sick. So at most it would be like maybe 1 in 100 something. And presumably you would hope that like these protocols are developing are supposed to keep the probability of the medical personnel getting infected at like a very low level. And so hopefully it's like well below 1 in 100.
So that's just the value for the percent risk of getting Ebola, but then would would she also have to take into account that we're presuming that she's rational, the fact that it only has a 50%
Yeah, right. So it'd really be right. So it'd be like 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000 chance of getting it, and then it has a very high mortality rate for most diseases, but still not 100%. Even in Africa with no treatment, it's like maybe over like 70% or something like that. And the assumption is like in an industrialized country with treatment, it'd probably be like under 50% or something like that. So right. So it'd be like 1 in 100, really it'd be more like 1 in 200 to like 1 in 2,000 or something like that, right? So I don't know. Given those sort of that range, let's just say you did like 1 in 500, and then the second question is like the financial repercussions of not treating the patient. So I don't know, what those repercussions would be or what she perceived them to be. Like at a minimum, I would think you'd have to use a bunch of like vacation days or like unpaid leave, right? Basically say like, no, now this is a full patient here, like I'm getting out of this hospital and not coming to work for the next week or something like that, right? So even if you're just talking about like taking a bunch of unpaid leave and stuff, you're still talking about maybe $1,000 of salary or something like that. So the minimum I would think would be like in the $1,000 range, and the maximum I have no idea, but it could go into the tens of thousands of dollars. So basically, if she thought that there was some non-trivial chance that she could like interrupt her career or even lose her job by refusing to do this stuff, once you're talking about basically getting fired from your job, we don't have like a specific dollar value that we attach to that, but there's obviously just a big dollar value in terms of interruption of earnings, having to find a new job and so forth, and also I think just the state of being unemployed is like a very negative state for people. So I think that then you'd be talking about probably at least 10,000, if not tens of thousands of dollars. So if you then multiply these numbers that we just wrote up here, it's not that hard to get into VSLs in the millions, right? Because if you had 1 in 500, if you at the lower range that would be like 500,000 because you're taking a 1 in 500 chance or risk for to avoid a financial repercussion of $1,000, and once you get up closer to 10,000, then you get up towards 5 million. So it's not I mean certainly if you didn't have much faith in the protocols of like basically the gear that they've given you, and or you didn't think that there would be much financial repercussion for saying like you just didn't want to do it and didn't think it was going to have any impact on your career or so forth, then there are certainly scenarios you can construct where the person with a VSL of a couple $1 million would definitely not want to take that risk. But it's also the case that I think for reasonable parameter values, it's what we saw is not inconsistent with somebody or the actions of somebody who would still have a VSL of like several $1 million. And the other thing, I mean, again with the risk, it's like you also know that that like in general like people aren't going to realize that somebody has Ebola, and then they'll have interactions where they're not taking any precautions, and yet they often still don't get sick. So you would tend to think that like if you are taking the proper precautions, that your risk would be very low, but obviously not low enough in this case. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to do the introduction to the stuff about adult pollution, basically the effects of pollution on adults. Basically talk about why it's more difficult to estimate these effects, and then we'll call it a day. So there is a lot less evidence on the effects of air pollution on adult health, and there's really sort of a couple of reasons for that. So the reason that's not related to data is just everybody cares about saving babies. But there's also like a fundamental statistical reason, which is that all of these infant health papers we've been talking about, they all leverage essentially short-term variation in air pollution or short-term changes in air pollution to estimate the effect of air pollution on infant health. And the reason that it's feasible to estimate effects on infant health, right, when you're using these short-term changes in air pollution, is that infants, of course, have very short gestation periods, right? So you could potentially look at a case where, say, there are elevated pollution levels for just 1 year. It could potentially be the case that the infant has been exposed to those elevated pollution levels for its entire life, plus like some of the time that it was in the womb, right? So basically, what you have there is like a short-term pollution shock is actually changing the entire like lifetime exposure of pollution for the infant. But when you start looking at adults, especially sort of older adults, since you think that's the group that's going to be most vulnerable to air pollution, in that case, short-term fluctuations only have a very minimal impact on the total amount of air pollution that an adult is exposed to over their lifetime, right? So if you're thinking about like lifetime exposure, and you say like, this year there happened to be high pollution levels in the Bay Area relative to Southern California or something, and I wonder whether or not that changed mortality for adults in the Bay Area relative to Southern California. The answer you'll get is probably not going to be that satisfying, because even a significant change in air pollution for this 1 year would still only amount to maybe like a 1/50 increase or basically a 2% increase or something in pollution exposure over an adult's entire lifetime. So to the extent that you think that sort of accumulations of pollution exposure could be important, it's going to be really hard to use these short-term fluctuations in pollution to try to get substantial differences in total pollution exposure. And so that then means that it's going to be kind of infeasible to use the differences type designs that we've been talking about to measure the effect of long-term exposure on adults. Basically, the way that we sort of put in our terminology, it's very difficult to find quasi-random variation in long-term exposure to air pollution. So with that sort of caveat, we will talk about a couple of types of studies. One is looking at what happens when you do have short-term pollution spikes, just what happens to like mortality and morbidity. And then the other is kind of just looking at cross-sectional relationships between areas that have high pollution, areas that have low pollution, how that just correlates with mortality.